Nuestro siguiente orador es el señor Mark Kleiman. Aquí hubo un cambio en el programa original. Originalmente iba a estar en este momento George Will. El señor George Will viene de Washington. Lamentablemente su avión literalmente por mal tiempo está estacionado en la pista. Entonces no sabemos en qué momento pueda retomar aquel viaje. Pero Mark Kleiman, que era uno de los otros oradores, simplemente vamos a invertir el orden y él va a estar con nosotros en este momento. Vamos a continuar para recapitular un poquito, recuperar el tiempo y les pido a todos atención a este importante discurso. Mark Kleiman, nos vamos a entrar ahora, es uno de los grandes expertos sobre este tema de drogas, policía, justicia, etc. Gracias por estar con nosotros. Thank you very much.
Mark Kleiman, profesor estadounidense de la Escuela de Asuntos Públicos de University of California, Los Ángeles. Es reconocido en Estados Unidos por su investigación en el tema de las drogas, autor de Marijuana Cost of Abuse y The Cost of Control and Against Excess, Drug Policy for Result. Su libro más reciente se titula When Brute Force Fails, How to Have Less Crime and Less Punishment, en el que argumenta que las fuerzas policiales deberían de ver cada arresto como una pérdida, no una victoria.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thanks for the honor of addressing this distinguished group. I am not and never have been George Will, and what I'm about to say is not what he would have said had the airline industry not deprived us of his presence. I want to take as my text for today's sermon the words of another great journalist, H.L. Mencken, who once said, "For every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong." So it is with the hard problem of drug abuse and addiction. So let me state that problem as I see it. Some people, a minority of all users, behave badly or foolishly while intoxicated, harming themselves and others. Some people, a minority for most drugs, and not the same minority necessarily as those who behave badly when addicted, lose some measure of voluntary control over their own drug taking. They fall into the disorders that common language calls addiction and the medical manuals call drug abuse or drug dependency. Now, to this hard problem, which is a human constant, prohibition offers a clear, simple, and wrong solution. Ban the drugs. And you ban the drugs, you abolish the problem. Now, that would be true if laws were self-enforcing, but of course they aren't. And illicit markets, which necessarily arise when behaviors that lots of people engage in are forbidden, add their own problems. And enforcement adds additional problems on top of that, not least the 500,000 people in prison in the U.S. for drug dealing. Now, that's an especial problem because drug markets tend to replace not only seized drugs, but incarcerated traffickers. It's hard to count how many kingpins have been put away, leaving the exactly same market behind them. That's a big difference between drug law enforcement and enforcement of laws against predatory crimes. There's nothing about putting a robber in prison that encourages other people to commit robbery, while putting a drug dealer in prison opens a market niche for a new drug dealer. So in the face of increasingly active and fairly transparently futile law enforcement and rising crime by drug users who are buying more and more expensive drugs and committing crimes to pay for it, and crimes by drug dealers who are engaging in violence around the markets and around resisting enforcement, the idea about drugs goes from a model where there are good things in the world that some people abuse to a model where all the drugs are evil things. This is a point that Abraham Lincoln made about alcohol back in the 1840s. So under this new ideology, all use of illicit drugs becomes abuse. Every user is an addict or an addict in training. And users are social enemies. The addicts because of the crimes they often commit, and the not addicts, the majority, precisely because the normal lives they lead despite illicit drug taking makes drug use seem attractive and normal. And of course the addicts and non-addicts alike are blamed for providing financial support to the violent illicit markets. The familiar anti-drug commercial in the US showing a young pot smoker saying, "I killed a judge today." Now, that's not entirely false. Of course, there wouldn't be any illicit markets if there weren't buyers. But it's odd to blame the buyers of illicit commodities for the fact that there are sellers of them. By the same token, drug sellers become thought of as the cause of drug abuse. And policy is based on the fantasy that arresting the next Mr. Big or the next huge seizure or dismantling the current drug cartel or merely the incarceration of more and more and more and more retail drug dealers will somehow solve the drug problem. And the additional fantasy is entertained that increased drug law enforcement somehow naturally will reduce violence and other non-drug crime, while in fact the natural tendency of law enforcement is to make, drug law enforcement, is to make crime and violence worse by raising the stakes of drug dealing. So the extreme of prohibition is the war on drugs with the extreme goal of a drug-free society, not counting, of course, caffeine, nicotine, or alcohol, which for these purposes, though for no other purposes, aren't drugs. So this conference, as I understand it, was called to consider the implications of the clear, simple, wrong idea that we can abolish the drug problem by banning some drugs. And the title of Mr. Will's address, had he been here to give it, would have been Drug Prohibition, a Second Chapter of Failure. But the drug problem is so hard, so complicated, so demanding, that it is called into existence not merely one clear, simple, wrong idea, but also a second, the inverse of the first. On this second theory, the drug problem as we observe it is largely an artifact of bad policy, called variously prohibition or the war on drugs. And if these were replaced by something called legalization or taxation and regulation or a public health approach or harm reduction, the prisons could be emptied of drug dealers and users, crime and police powers dramatically reduced, and the problems of intoxicated misbehavior somehow mystically turn out to be self-limiting. That's the account we were just given, right? There's either some mystical process of self-limitation or, and there's a comforting myth that only some people are vulnerable to addiction and all of them are already addicted, so there's no additional risk. Or alternatively, that the problems of drug abuse will lead to yet to be developed miracles of education and treatment. There's no facts in the world, it seems to me, to support any of that. We observe today that drug trafficking does much more damage than drug abuse, but that's against the level of drug abuse, thank you, that we experience under prohibition. The examples of alcohol and tobacco, it seems to me, should be sufficient to convince us that legal and actively promoted drugs are likely to be much more widely used and abused than illegal and clandestinely supplied drugs, partly because the prices are much lower. And the political economy that maintains inadequately vigorous regulation and taxation policies with respect to alcohol and tobacco should warn us about the dangers of imagining that we could legalize drugs and maintain strong controls on them in the face of the lobbying pressure from the newly created licit drug industries. The alcohol industry is completely dependent on people who are dependent on alcohol. 80% of the alcohol is consumed by people who drink too much, the top 20% of drinkers. So when alcohol companies tell you that they're in favor of responsible drinking, they must mean they're planning to go out of business. Because it's not the responsible drinkers that build the breweries. There's an old Yiddish proverb that says, an innkeeper loves a drunkard, but not as a son-in-law. So, illicit drug business will be dependent on its dependent users. All of its marketing effort and all of its political effort will be devoted to maximizing the number of people who don't have control of their consumption of whatever the drug is. Because a single 8-joint-a-day wake-and-bake smoker is more important to the marijuana industry, licit or illicit, than 50 people who smoke a joint on Saturday night. That's the arithmetic of addiction and of the supply of addictive commodities. And that's because of, not despite, the fact that addiction is a minority problem. So there's every reason to think that the free market, unleashed on such attractive commodities as cannabis and cocaine and methamphetamine and heroin, would work its magic of expanding the market and specifically the number of problem users. But we're told we could have taxes and regulations in place of prohibition. Well, let's take a look at taxation. Canada, in the 1990s, attempted to impose a $5 a pack tax on cigarettes. And that attempt was defeated by massive smuggling from its southern neighbor. Somehow the U.S. never got decertified as a result. But smuggling across the U.S.-Canadian border, even less defended than the U.S.-Mexican border, made it impossible for Canada to actually collect a $5 a pack tax on cigarettes, and it had to be repealed. Now, a pack of cigarettes weighs something less than an ounce. Right? So imagine the difficulty of collecting the ounce-level taxes you'd need to keep cannabis prices from collapsing in the face of legalization. And an ounce of cannabis in the U.S. sells for about $300. So a $5 an ounce tax is not very impressive, and yet Canada, the Canadian experience, suggests we might not even be able to collect even that much. Calling something a tax or a regulation doesn't mean you don't have to enforce it. As long as the regulation or the taxation is sufficient to discourage behavior that people otherwise want to engage in, then someone will want to evade the tax or the regulation. The incentive for profitable evasion of taxes and regulations is precisely as high as the incentive for evasion of prohibition, unless the regulations and taxes are less restrictive. So however restrictive you want your taxation and regulation policy to be, that's how much enforcement you're going to need. And the fact that people are now violating regulatory rules or committing tax evasion rather than violating prohibitions and committing drug smuggling doesn't matter at all to the operations. Now, we're seeing that in the U.S. now. Right? We have very high cigarette taxes in some places. 3/4 of the cigarettes sold in the South Bronx are illicit, are not tax-paid cigarettes. And if we want to keep reducing the volume of smoking, and tobacco remains more heavily used than any illicit drug by a very substantial margin, continues to kill 400,000 Americans a year. If we want to keep that level of abuse coming down, we're going to need higher taxes, and therefore we're going to need more enforcement of those taxes. There's going to be, there already is, an illicit market in cigarettes, and the more enforcement we do against it, the nastier that market's going to be. There's a trade-off between the public health objective of reducing drug abuse and the law enforcement objective of generating public safety and order. And accepting that trade-off is the beginning of sound reasoning about the drug problem. The notion that we can have a freebie, that we can either have a magically drug-free world with no enforcement by doing prohibition successfully, or a magically drug abuse-free world despite the lack of enforcement by doing taxes and regulations successfully. Those are not real-world options. are real-world options in the face of the fact that some people develop drug problems or behave badly when intoxicated, or a choice of evils. And the beginning of wisdom is to accept that and to reason soundly about what evils we want to choose. There's a tendency, in the face of these really unfortunate alternatives, to imagine compromise solutions. So, for example, we could decriminalize drug use. That is to say, we could stop arresting drug dealers, drug users. Not a bad idea in many circumstances, but doesn't do anything to change the level of bloodshed around the drug business. Doesn't even much reduce incarceration because, in fact, it's not drug users, by and large, who are incarcerated. It's drug dealers. Of those 500,000 people in prison in the U.S. for drug law violations, more than 90% are there for selling or possessing amounts that indicate they were selling. So decriminalization is probably a fine idea in many circumstances. Doesn't really solve the problem we have. We could legalize cannabis. Now, I actually think that's a pretty good idea. Just a little promotion, if I may. There's a book coming out from Oxford in a couple of months by John Calkins and some others, including me, on cannabis legalization. It's an analytic book, not an advocacy book, but my bottom line is that we ought to let people grow their own pot or join consumer co-ops, but that we shouldn't have companies that sell marijuana. But if we had to choose between the alcohol model and what we now have for cannabis, I think I'd choose the alcohol model, though not at all cheerfully. But imagine we did that. Imagine we did that. How much would that reduce drug violence in Mexico? Not very much. About 20% of the revenues of the major Mexican drug trafficking organizations come from selling cannabis to the U.S. Other 80% is heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine, drugs that aren't nearly as plausibly legalizable. So there's a tendency to imagine that small changes in the current drug war would get us the benefits of legalization and retain the benefits of prohibition. Seems to me that's one slightly ungenerous reading of the Global Commission report, is that it wants to claim inconsistent benefits. Now, criticizing the fallacies underlying current policies is a necessary precondition to fixing them, but it's only a precondition. Abstract opposition to the drug war can be what the psychologists call displacement activity from doing the hard work of crafting better policies. Being a legalizer, it might be said, is never having to say you're sorry, because all of the catastrophic results of the current policies are somebody else's fault. But saying that the problems wouldn't exist in the absence of the drug war is really no more constructive than saying the problems wouldn't exist in the absence of drug dealing or drug use. Those are simply facts about the world that we need to accommodate ourselves to. All right, so let me talk for a moment about practical steps. Sorry, I have a monitor in front of me that now says 30. Does that mean I have 30 minutes? No, it doesn't. Okay. All right. Here's the good news. You only have 16 more minutes to suffer. No, I take it back. You only have 9 more minutes to suffer. Oh, you're so lucky. No, wait a second. Now it's counting down. Oh, well. All right. For some amount of time, let me talk about practical steps. Practical step number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, raise alcohol taxes. With the exception of some countries in Northern Europe, every country in the world sets the tax on alcohol way below the damage that alcohol does to drinkers, to their families, and to the victims of their drunken assaults and drunken auto accidents. Phil Cook has estimated that if we tripled the alcohol tax, federal alcohol tax in the U.S., which would take the cost of a beer from about $1 to about $1.20, we would reduce the homicide rate in the U.S. by 6%. Right? That's 1,000 people a year who wouldn't die. No enforcement, no midnight raids, no no-knock warrants, just a simple change in the tax law. And it turns out at somewhat higher prices, people use somewhat less. And the people who most likely to use somewhat less are young people, poor people, and heavy drinkers. No, those are all good categories in which to reduce drinking. And so when I hear my fellow opponents of total legalization announce that they're in favor of fighting drugs, and notice that none of them is lobbying for higher alcohol taxes, I sort of wonder a little bit about their sincerity. Now again, that doesn't seem to me like an argument for legalization, because the difficulty of raising alcohol taxes is precisely because there's a very powerful alcohol industry that doesn't want the taxes raised. And it's very hard for me to see how you could fix that problem. But that doesn't keep the rest of us from arguing for higher alcohol taxation. And one way to do that, and one thing I've been trying to do for the last 30 years, is reject the formula alcohol and drugs and start saying alcohol and other drugs. Because of course alcohol is a drug, but as long as people think they can drink and not be drug users, heavy drinking will be a lot more fashionable than it ought to be. And weak alcohol policy will be a lot more politically palatable than it ought to be. People don't understand that when they vote against an increase in alcohol taxation, they're voting for an increase in drug abuse. So that's fairly high on my list. A more radical idea around alcohol would be to try to stop problem drinkers from drinking. Now, there are two different approaches to this. There's the one I came up with and the one that works. The one I came up with, which I still sort of like, is, in the US at least, if you look younger than I do, and you want to buy alcohol, you have to show your driver's license in order to demonstrate that you're old enough to buy a drink. So here's my California driver's license. Some of you may be able to see it. And it has my picture on the right-hand side. If I were under 21, which alas I'm not, the picture would be on the left-hand side. That saves the bartender or the package clerk the work of doing the arithmetic of subtracting my birth date from the current date, and simply shows on the face of the card whether I'm old enough to buy a drink or not. So here's my proposal. Somebody gets convicted of drunk driving or drunken assault, take away his driving license, and give it back to him with a picture on the other side of the license. So he's got a license to drive, but not to drink. Now that would require that everybody buying a drink be carded, which seems to people who support the war on drugs like an impossible nanny state intervention, but I don't understand why. You've got to show your credit card to pay for the drink. You might as well show your driver's license to buy it. If we did that, and we were careful about how many people we delicensed, because if we delicensed all of the heavy drinkers, then we'd create a new big illicit market in alcohol. But if we delicensed the 5% worst drinkers, we could probably put a dent in their drinking and their drunken misbehavior. Not 100%. They'd figure out ways to get boozed, but at least be harder for them to drink in bars, which is probably a good thing. And also a deterrent to drunken misbehavior if the consequence is losing your right to drink with your friends. So that's my fantasy version, which I'd still like to see tried someplace. The version that turns out to actually work was invented by a district attorney who became a judge and then the attorney general of South Dakota, a guy named Larry Long, and he calls his program 24/7 sobriety. So repeat convicted drunk drivers and now also some other alcohol-related offenders, alcoholic assailants, for example, are given, instead of prison, which they could get in South Dakota for a second drunk driving conviction, the option of coming in for 90 consecutive days, twice a day, to do a breathalyzer test, with the promise that if they ever don't blow zero, they'll be in jail that night. And it turns out that about 99% of those appointments are kept, and the people actually haven't been drinking. Bo Kilmer at Rand is doing an evaluation of that. We'll see what the results are, but it's at least an interesting idea that you could prohibit, and this actually is an idea that's in John Stuart Mill, that you could prohibit drugs specifically to the people who behave badly under their influence. That, it seems to me, would be a very good partner with a decriminalization of some of the illicit drugs. So that's about managing people who drink badly. Now, what about the people who use illicit drugs and are also active offenders? Those are very important people. They're a large chunk of the active offenders. About 50% of the people arrested for a felony in the U.S. test positive for one or another illicit drug. They're also a very large chunk of the drug market, since it's heavy users, not light users, who account for most of the market. And most of the heavy users wind up being criminally active to support their habit. So something like 50 or 60% of all the illicit hard drugs, not cannabis, all the cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine sold in the U.S. is sold to people who got arrested last year. People whose names we know, and who in many cases are under a specific legal obligation not to use drugs because they're on probation, they're on parole, or they're on pretrial release. Now, the current probation system does a very bad job at managing their drug abuse. It tests them occasionally, usually on a scheduled basis. And most of the time, when they test dirty, the probation officer says, don't do that again. And the second time, the probation officer says, don't do that again. And the third time, the probation officer says, if you keep doing that, you're going to get in trouble. And the seventh or ninth or 12th time, the probation officer says, we're seeing the judge. And either the judge says, don't do that again, or the judge says, 6 months. Right? You're off to jail or prison for a long spell. Now, if you wanted to maximize the number of people going to jail while minimizing your effect on drug abuse, randomized deferred severity would be a very good way to do it. Right? It's the worst possible system. And a judge in Hawaii named Steve Alm figured out the alternative, which, by the way, anybody who'd successfully raised a child could have told him, which is don't have as many rules as we now have on probation. Make it clear what the rules are, monitor compliance with them, and punish every instance of detected violation, not severely. Severity is the great enemy of swiftness and certainty. Swiftness and certainty are the key to changing behavior. So the program, which he calls HOPE, which starts with a direct warning specifically to the offender, here's what you're not allowed to do, here's the consequence to you if you keep doing it. Frequent testing on a random basis. They call in every morning to find out whether that's their day to come in for a drug test. And immediate but quite mild couple-day in jail sanctions every time they use. And a police force ready to chase them if they don't show up. Results at 1 year, 80% of the hardcore methamphetamine users who are also active property criminals or violent criminals who get in the program, 80% of them have not used in the last 3 months, are free on the street in compliance with their probation conditions. No drug treatment program in the world could get within a factor of 4 of that result. In a randomized controlled trial, the people on the HOPE program, as it's called, used 80% fewer drugs, missed 90% fewer appointments, had 50% fewer arrests, 50% fewer revocations, spent 50% fewer days behind bars. Program saves way more money than it costs, partly because it economizes on treatment resources. As opposed to a drug court or a diversion program, everyone's assessed, everyone's treated. Under HOPE, people are allowed to succeed on their own. And they're only required to go to drug treatment if they repeatedly fail. As a result, the ones that are sent to drug treatment are sent to high-quality, high-intensity drug treatment because you can afford to do that for a limited number of people. So that program, if put into effect, would massively reduce the U.S. drug problem and the pressure that the U.S. puts on Mexico. All right, I'm now over time, but I'm going to take another 90 seconds to talk about something that the U.S. and Mexico could jointly do about the specific Mexican violence problem. The general formula here is violence minimizing drug law enforcement. I said earlier that drug law enforcement's native tendency is to increase crime and violence. But that's true if it's focused on drug dealing generically. It can be false if drug enforcement is focused on the most violent drug dealers. It's possible to create a disincentive for violence in the drug market by making law enforcement, which is, after all, the single biggest cost faced by an illicit drug firm, making law enforcement a consequence of the use of violence rather than something that violence can help you resist. The extreme form of this would be to adapt David Kennedy's ceasefire model from Boston. Pick one of the big Mexican drug trafficking organizations on the basis of pre-announced and transparent criteria as the most violent, announce an all-out attack on them using the very limited capacity of Mexican law enforcement, but the far less limited capacity of U.S. law enforcement. And the notion would be to attack the customers, the distributors in the U.S. who are buying their drugs from whichever the target organization is. And the hope would be to give them a case of commercial leprosy, where nobody wanted to touch their stuff. Given the vigor of U.S. domestic drug law enforcement, I think that's completely feasible. I think we could put any one, I stress any one, of the major drug trafficking organizations out of business, which wouldn't reduce the flow of drugs. The slack would be taken up by other organizations, or the people in the target organization would simply re-affiliate. But the leadership of the target organization would find that they didn't have anything to lead anymore. Now imagine you've done that, and there are lots of reasons to think that might fail. Imagine you've done it, and then announce you're running the contest again. We're going to find the second most violent organization, and we're going to destroy them next. The hope would be to generate a race to the bottom in rates of violence among Mexican drug traffickers. Basically, hold the U.S. revenues of those organizations hostage to their willingness to conduct their business in a relatively nonviolent fashion. Now, long list of things that could be wrong with that, ways it could fail, things we don't know that we'd have to know to start it. But I want to make the following claim. That might work. It's not silly to think it would work. And it could work in the relatively near term, period of months. As far as I know, that makes it unique. I have not heard a single idea that you could actually decide today to do that a year from now could plausibly be expected to lead to less violence among drug dealers in Mexico. And so in the absence of a better idea, I think we ought to staff this one out. But we ought to put a temporary moratorium on discussions of fantasy ideas about the sweet by and by, and ask what we could do in the near term to get the level of violence in Mexico down from its current catastrophic level. All right, I've exhausted my time, and I'm afraid your patience, but many thanks.